Hello and welcome to Fresh Perspectives. My name is Gail, and today my guest is that really nice attorney that comes on my program every now and then to tell us, give us information that we need to know when we're going to be doing certain things. His name is Kameron Brooks. Thank you for coming on, for being so generous with your time.
Always a pleasure, Gail. Glad to be here.
Yeah. And today we are going to be talking about real estate sales and purchases. Kameron, are there many attorneys that handle real estate transactions in the county?
Well, Gail, I would say probably most attorneys do, or at least most law firms do. Mm-hmm. There are some attorneys that only practice certain areas, maybe litigation, things like that, but real estate practice is usually part of all law firms' mix of legal things. Now, as you know, in our firm, we are a planning firm, mm-hmm. so we engage in estate planning, asset protection planning, business succession planning, tax planning, so our real estate practice is very limited, really, to just our clients. And most of the time, it's a real estate transaction that involves a trust that our client has, and that's why we're doing that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, most attorneys handle real estate in the county. I have dealt with attorneys from Jamestown and Dunkirk and Westfield and even down in the Clymer area, and they're all very good. I mean, mm-hmm. I think we're fortunate in Chautauqua County to have attorneys that are very good with real estate practice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, you said most of the attorneys are very good that deal with it. What about the ones that are involved with criminal law?
Well, I know a few attorneys that a big part of their practice is criminal law, but they also do real estate.
Oh, they do both?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's like whatever primary business I have, there's always time to do some real estate work. Mm-hmm. From an attorney's perspective, real estate practice is interesting. It's generally not adversarial. You have a buyer who wants to buy, a seller who wants to sell, and they want to get the deal done. So the attorneys and the brokers and the parties are working together to move the transaction along to get it done. So that's why most attorneys do have that as part of their practice.
Oh, okay. Now, how does a real estate transaction in New York differ from other states?
That is a good question, because New York is quite different than a lot of states. For instance, Ohio, Texas, Florida, those real estate transactions are typically done through a title company. So the attorneys are not even involved. The value of that is the transaction goes much quicker, much easier. The downside, and the reason New York is different, is that the parties themselves, the buyers and the sellers, have nobody looking out for their particular rights. A title company will only do the transaction, documents, schedule the closing, we're done. If there are issues that come up, legal issues that come up from time to time, the title company that won't have anything to do with it. So New York has always been more protective, more consumer protective, and that's why we don't have title companies actually engaged in closing transactions in New York. We more insist upon each client or each party has their own attorney to look out for their own interest. So it takes longer, it's more cumbersome, but people have more protection, I think, over their legal rights.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so there's more to it, but it's a safer way of doing it then.
New York thinks so, anyway.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'll tell you this. A friend of mine that's retired now had a classmate of his who practices law in California. Mm-hmm. And he was talking to my friend here in New York, and he said, "Why do you guys do what you do?" He said, "You spend all this time curing these problems, solving these issues to real estate closing. In California, we let the closing happen, and then we're involved with the aftermarket litigation."
Oh.
So
okay.
That really is the difference between having title companies do it and then having some issue come up afterwards where the lawyers get involved and then they fight about things.
Oh.
Versus in New York, we solve those problems ahead of time or the deal doesn't close.
Oh, okay. Now, would that be, those issues, would that be like repairs that need to be done to the house?
Could be things like property that is supposed to stay with the house, the seller wants to take, or it could be some title curing issues. Maybe there's a break in the chain of title or something like that. It could be expectations that one party has that the other party's not doing, so there's a controversy. In New York, all those things are going to be solved before closing or accommodated after closing by escrow agreements. In other states, the title company's just preparing the documents and saying, give me the money, we're ready to close.
Okay. What should a seller do when deciding to sell?
I think the first thing any seller ought to do, if it's a residence, the residence, the house itself, ought to be staged properly. It ought to show well. A lot of brokers will tell a seller, potential seller, the broker will go through the house, and many of them will say, all right, you need to declutter the house. All these pictures on this wall of all your family, take them down, patch the holes, paint the wall, put up one picture. You don't want the buyer to come into a house that's someone else's house. You want them to see it as their house if they're interested in buying it.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing is to make sure that the house is in presentable condition. The second thing then is the seller has to consider whether they're going to use a broker or sell it themselves. And there are virtues either way. Personally, I think it's nice to have a broker in between you and the buyer so that you have that buffer when you're negotiating. If you sell a house yourself, of course, you save the broker's commission, but it might be worth paying that money to have that buffer and someone who's going to do a lot of the legwork for you.
Oh, okay.
What I see as a problem in real estate transactions historically, and I've been doing this for 42 years, and the process always seems to be the same, but I think it ought to be different. Because a real estate transaction, once the brokers negotiate the contract with the buyer and the seller and everything gets signed, a lot of times the first time the attorneys know what's happening is when they get a copy of the contract. It's a big surprise. We get the contract and we say, oh, our client is selling something. That's the first we hear about it. Well, at that point, we need to get the client in and say, if it's the seller, and say, okay, we need your title search, we need your survey, we need your paid tax receipts, things like that. And that takes a little while for the seller to gather those things together. And now we have to involve a title company to update the title search or create a new one. And perhaps, most of the time, probably have a surveyor that needs to go out and survey. And if the property is outside of a city, so you have a private septic system, then you have to involve the Department of Health to have the septic system and the water well checked. So now you're involving 3 more entities into the mix, and you have a lot of people now that have to do a job, and they have to fit it into their schedule. And what happens is that the length of time from contract to closing just keeps getting longer because all these other people have to do their jobs. And historically, the selling season has been the summertime.
Oh, okay.
So the surveyors, the title companies, the health department, they get very busy in the summertime. So that adds more delays on things. So that's, I see as a problem. I think it's a solvable problem for sellers if they go ahead and do some things ahead of time.
Before they decide to put the house up for sale.
Well, maybe once they've decided to put the house up for sale and they contact a broker, let's say, to list the house, I think that they should then make an appointment with their attorney, a sit-down appointment, not a phone call, but a sit-down appointment, and find out what the attorney's going to need once you have a contract of sale. And get those things to the attorney's office. And I also think that maybe the seller ought to have their title search updated early. I look at it this way, Gail. If you're a seller, you're going to pay for the title search one way or the other.
Right.
So if you pay for it upfront now, what's the difference than if you have a sale and a closing 6 to 9 months later? You're going to pay for it then.
Right.
Well, if we have the title search done now we have it. As soon as we get the contract, we can send it to the buyer's attorney. It's all done. Same thing with a survey. If you know you're going to have a survey on your property, why not get it done early? Pay the surveyor, get the prints, and then we have it. So I think it speeds things up.
What about having the inspector come? Oh no, or is that the buyer that gets the inspector?
That's a good comment, because typically what we're seeing today is most brokers are recommending to buyers that they have a home inspector come and inspect the home as a condition of the contract. So we enter into the contract, but it's conditioned upon the buyer obtaining a home inspection report that they're happy with. If they're not happy with it in any way, they can get out of the contract.
Oh, okay.
Quite often what happens is the home inspector comes back and says, okay, I identify these problems, and they should be fixed. Either the seller goes ahead and fixes them, or the seller maybe gives a credit to the buyer, and the buyer says, okay, I'll fix them later. That quite often would happen. But that's becoming more popular. 20 years ago, even maybe 10 years ago, you never saw that, but it's very popular now. So one thing a seller could do ahead of time, maybe it makes sense for the seller to hire a home inspector to come in and inspect the home before the buyer's inspector comes. Let's find out what defects there are, what repairs need to be made, and we can make them ahead of time so we're not slowing down the closing process.
Yeah.
A home inspector will probably cost $200-300. It's not a big expense, but it'll identify for you what maybe you should have taken care of before your buyer even looks at the property. Now, the other inspection that might be helpful ahead of time is the septic and water inspection. So if you're outside of a municipality where you have sewer and water, you have a water well and a private septic system.
Right.
In Chautauqua County, the health department has a newer rule. It's been around since I think 2016, but you must have your septic system pumped within 3 years before it's tested by the health department, or it won't be tested.
Oh, okay.
So it would be smart, if you know you're going to sell your house, to be sure the septic system is pumped, and then 30 days later have it tested by the health department, or at least have it ready to be tested once you get a contract of sale so that you can go ahead and contact them and get that done.
Yeah. Now, by pumping, you mean when you have somebody come to your home and you have to dig a hole so that they can come and suck everything out of it then, right? Yes,
the guys come up with what is called a honey wagon.
Yeah, well, I've seen on some trucks service with a smell and things like that, you know, or some of them just say that they're septic service, you know, so where they take it, I don't know.
Nobody asked that question. No, I think they wind up, if I remember right, I think they wind up spreading it on farm fields.
Really?
Yeah. It's just sludge. You know, it's the same thing that the municipal sewer districts have to deal with the same thing. They have this sludge and they have to dispose of it. And it's perfectly fine to spread on fields. But for the homeowner, yes, you have to locate your septic system, and some homeowners have no idea where it is. You have to locate it, you have to open it up, and then the septic people can come and pump out the tank. So it's not dry, but it's completely pumped out. Then you have to wait 30 days to have it inspected, because the health department assumes that it's going to take 30 days to fill it back up with water.
Okay.
And when they test it, they want to test that the wastewater is going into the septic tank and out into the leach bed. And what they're looking for is it's a fluorescent green dye, and they're looking for that to surface somewhere.
A fluorescent green dye?
Yeah, it's a dye.
Oh, when they come to inspect
Yeah,
it, they
when they-
put it in there?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they run it down the kitchen sink or something like that. And they may come back the next day looking for it, but they're looking for that dye to surface somewhere on the ground. If it does, then your system has failed. Then you have to have it repaired.
Now, what if a person had a house, an old house, and that had to be torn down, and the house was like over 100 years old, and so the water line to the house and like that would be really old too. Does that quite often have to be replaced?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to, but off the top of my head, I would say this. If you were deconstructing an old house and building a brand new house, my guess is that you're going to have a new approved septic system.
Okay.
Now, the water well could be perfectly fine, but maybe the line needs to be replaced. Water wells, or quality of water well water, is easier to deal with from a real estate transaction perspective because the health department tests water for bacteria. And if the certain bacteria is indicated in the water, then there's a procedure to flush the well and see if that clears it up. If not, the worst case, you put a chlorinator on or a UV light system on, and you're good to go. It's a couple $1,000s, not that big a deal.
If the house was inside the village limits, would you need to get a new water line if it was from a really old house? You know, the village water supply? Would that have to be replaced or not?
It may not have to be. I think it's just a matter of whether the line is in good condition and works well.
Oh, okay.
But if you have a house that is on a municipal water system, then for a transfer, real estate transfer, it does not have to be tested. So if you have public water and public sewer on a real estate transaction, you don't have to do anything.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It's really those people outside of the villages and the cities where they have their own private well and a private septic system. That's where you have to have those things tested. The problem with the septic systems is that, and I would think from an owner's perspective, if I'm the seller and I'm going to sell my house, I'd like to know that that system's going to pass. Because I have an idea what my house is worth, what I'm willing to sell it for. But if I sold it for that price, and then the septic system is tested, and it fails, and the county tells me I have to have a whole new system, it may be $5,000, but it may be $10,000.
Oh,
it depends
yeah.
on the soil conditions. So if I had to put a brand new system in, and it cost me $10,000, I'm not going to be happy with the sale price that I sold it for.
Oh, yeah.
I want more money.
Yeah.
Because now I can sell it for more money, I think, in my mind, because I can say I have a brand new septic system. So if you're the buyer, I can tell you, here's my house, and I have a brand new septic system. You're not going to have any trouble with it for years. But that's not what usually happens in my experience. Quite often, we get into a transaction where the septic system cannot be inspected because the house was vacant.
Oh.
It's got to be,
Okay.
someone's got to be living there for 30 days before the county will test it.
Oh, okay.
So if you have a seller who's moved out of the area, let's say, and the house is vacant, it's been vacant for 4 or 5 months, and now they've sold it, well, the health department won't inspect the system until someone has been living there for 30 days.
Oh.
Which necessarily means we're going to have a real estate closing, the buyer's going to move in, we're going to have to wait 30 days after the buyer has moved in before we can even schedule the test, and there's going to be an escrow, money set aside out of the sale proceeds to pay for the new system in case the system fails and it has to be replaced. And sometimes we have closings that happen in December, January, February. That system's not going to be inspected until maybe May.
Oh, probably.
Because if the
yeah.
ground is frozen, the health department can't inspect it. So this is a problem for sellers, because if you're a seller, you want your money and you want to get out of Dodge. You don't want to have money tied up for 4, 5, 6 months waiting to get it. But sadly, that's going to be the case. So let's say this time of year, we're closing in on October. If a sale were going to happen, say October, November, early December, I would want my seller to have that system inspected as soon as possible, before the cold weather comes, because you can save yourself an escrow for 6 months maybe by having it done ahead of time. So that's a lot about septic systems. Probably too much. But it's important.
Yeah, yeah.
It is important.
Yeah, it really is. Now, what if it's not a personal residence?
Okay. Pretty much the same rules still apply. If you don't have a residence, maybe it's a piece of vacant land, maybe it has a barn or garage on it or something like that. I think you still, as a seller, you want to have the property in best condition to show. I don't think you want a lot of junk on the property and trash and things like that, because buyers are not as likely to want to clean up someone else's mess.
Oh, right.
20 years ago, maybe so, but now everybody realizes it costs money to take things to the landfill.
Right, right.
And I don't want to have to pay someone to bring a truck in to take your stuff and take it to a landfill and pay the landfill to get rid of it. So the cleaner you have the property, the better. But otherwise, everything else really kind of applies. You may not have the water well and septic issue because it's vacant land, and that's okay. With a non-residence piece of property, there are some income tax issues that you need to pay attention to.
Oh, okay.
See, if you are selling your personal residence, if you qualify, and most people do, the transaction is not even reported to the IRS.
Oh.
So if you are a married couple and it's your personal residence, you've lived in it 2 out of the last 5 years, you can exempt up to $500,000 of capital gain and pay no tax on it.
Really?
Which
Wow.
is going to be most people selling their homes. So that's good. If you have a non-residential piece of property or a rental house, I mean, that could be residential, but you don't live there, someone else does. So a residential or a rental house, vacant land, timberland, whatever it is, it becomes important to know what your cost basis is. Now, that's not part of the real estate transaction, it's not part of the closing, but it's going to come down the road when you go to have your taxes done. There's going to be a closing statement, you're going to take it to your tax preparer, and the first question that person's going to ask is, what is your cost basis? And it would be better, in my opinion, for you to know that ahead of time so that you can give them the information. With a house that's a personal residence, the cost basis becomes irrelevant unless you have over $500,000 of taxable gain on the sale, which not too many houses in Chautauqua County are going to fit that. But on all others, yeah, it becomes important to know how much I paid for this property. So I can tell the accountant or whoever, yes, I paid $10,000 for it. I'm selling it for $12,000. Now they have the information they need. The harder one is people who inherit property.
Oh.
So I inherited this land from my parents 20 years ago. So when we ask someone what's your cost basis, they may not have any idea. But the cost basis is the value of the property when they inherited it 20 years ago.
Okay.
And you can, it takes a little bit of work, but you can get to that number. But you have to get to that number because you have to have a cost basis to put on the tax return. So I think for non-residential property, aside from the normal closing requirements just to close the transaction, the tax issues are important to know because nobody wants to scramble for information on April 15th. You want to have that done well ahead of time.
Right.
I had a client that sold a lake house up here. It was a second residence, so it didn't qualify as a primary residence. And I like these clients because they called me and said, we're selling our property. What do we need to do? And I told them, I need your title search, we need the survey, all the things for the closing. And then I said, what's your cost basis? Well, they bought the house, they improved it, they added things on, and this client is pretty good. He had all the receipts for everything he put into the house.
Yeah.
So we were able to calculate exactly what the cost basis was of the house, and he still had a pretty healthy gain on the sale of it, but he knew what his cost basis was. And we weren't paying more tax, or he wasn't paying more tax than he had to.
Oh,
So
okay.
all that record keeping is important for second homes or vacant land, things like that.
Now, about the vacant land and making things presentable and everything. Now, if the vacant land is out in the country, you know, it's not inside a village or a city or anything, and it's out in the country, and it might be a few acres or something. In order to show this land, do the sellers have to somehow keep a path mode so that people can walk around on the property to look at it?
Not really. If you're talking about pure vacant land, as long as there's a way to get from the public road to the property, I think that's good enough.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wondered, I thought maybe people might want to go around and see the whole thing.
Well, it may make sense to have some sort of roadway that is at least brush hogged or something to make it easier. I think I look at it this way: make it look more visually appealing. Make your buyer look at it and say, "I like this," rather than having to cut through weeds and thorns and everything to get to it.
Right. That's what I was thinking. Yeah, because it takes a lot of work to maintain property.
Yeah.
So anyways, let's see here. There's something here about knowing who owns the property and who has the right to sell. That's if it's more than one individual.
Yes, there are times, probably not very frequent, but there are times when more than one person owns the property. And if there are three people that own the property, and this might be a case where three siblings inherited from their parents. So one of them wants to sell. Well, you can't sell the whole property without the other two being involved. So
Right.
you've got to make sure you know who owns the property before you list it, because you don't want to list the property with the broker, get all the way to a contract, have the title search done, and have the buyer's attorney say, you only own 1/3 of this. Where are the other two people? And have the whole thing blow up. The other thing that I get involved with probably most of the time with our real estate is many of my clients own their property in a trust, and they may not be the trustee. So it's not the client who's living in the house that's selling it, it's the trustee of their trust. So properly identifying who the seller really is so that you have a good binding contract, can be important. Some people own property in the name of a corporation or a limited liability company, and in their minds they think it's my property, but really it's this entity that I own that's the owner. So when you're dealing with a real estate transaction and dealing with brokers, it's important to know who actually owns the property, who has the legal right to sign a contract to sell it.
Okay, so if it's like a few different heirs that inherited the property, then and only one of them wants to sell, then that person can sell like their percent?
Yeah, that is a good question because I'm dealing with that right now.
Oh, are you really?
In an estate. Yes, if let's say we have three people, three siblings inherited 200 acres of land. One sibling says, I want out. I don't want this property. I want to get my money and go away. I don't live around here. I can't use it. The other two say, no, we don't want to sell it. So that's not uncommon to have that scenario. Hopefully, if they all get along well, the other two can buy the first person out.
Right.
Say, okay, what's the
right.
value? What's an acceptable sale price? I'll deed my interest to you, and be done with it. It's harder, and that's the situation I'm dealing with right now because it's a farmhouse and 10 acres.
Oh, okay.
And I have 2 out of 3 people that want to sell and 1 person who doesn't want to sell.
Okay.
So maybe we'll work out an arrangement where the 1 person who doesn't want to sell will buy out the other 2. But if not, any person who owns any interest in real estate has the absolute right to get either their slice of it or the money value out
The
of it.
money value for their part
Right.
of it.
So it's called a partition action. It should, in my opinion, it should never happen because people who don't want to sell should recognize that the person has the absolute right
Oh,
to get their
okay.
money or their share
Okay.
and work it out. Who wants to spend $10,000 of attorney's fees in litigation just to get to the end where the person is going to win? I mean, there's no question. The person is going to win. They are going to get either a slice of the land or they're going to get money from the sale. It will happen. You can't stop it. In a partition action, there are 2 things that happen. The judge has to determine who are the owners. That's usually the easy part. And then the second part, the judge has to determine, can the property be divided into 3 pieces, with each one owning their separate piece? If so, then he appoints what this law calls commissioners. And they're just taxpayers, people that own land in that town.
Oh, okay.
And those 3 people will determine how that land gets divided up. If the judge determines that the property cannot physically be divided, like a house, then he orders that it be sold.
Oh.
It has to be sold, and then the money's given to the 3 owners.
Oh, okay. So sometimes the person that doesn't want to sell gets lost out, loses
Well,
what
yeah.
they wanted to keep.
Yeah, they lose what they want to keep because they're not keeping that house. That's why it makes no sense to me to be involved with a partition action. Let's agree, if someone wants out, let's let them out. It's just a matter of how much the price is going to be and the other people buy them out, and if they can't afford to buy them out, too bad.
Uh-oh.
They're going to have to sell the house, I guess.
Oh,
It's
man.
much easier to deal with if you have vacant land. If you've got a couple hundred acres of vacant land, yeah, you can divide it up physically.
Okay. Okay. Now, should somebody list the property with a real estate broker or self-advertise?
A lot of people would like to sell property and not pay the broker's commission, and I get that. And sometimes you may have people who want to buy. They'll let you know. Maybe a parent dies and there's a neighbor or somebody that says, hey, I want to buy that house. So maybe you can negotiate with them. I have had clients that have done that, and what I've suggested is that they get a real estate appraisal or a market valuation from a broker. Let's find out what the broker thinks the property is worth. Now you know what to ask and where you should be negotiating. So if a person does that themselves, works with someone who's already interested in the property, or maybe they advertise it, same thing, you need to know what the value is. And then when you find a buyer and you're not using a broker, then one of the attorneys has to prepare the contract. And in my experience, it takes a little bit of effort to get the information you need, because let's say it's a home and the seller has a buyer already interested at a price, and I said, well, I need to know the names, exactly how they want them to appear on the deed, what the down payment's going to be, and of course that's never talked about. I said, well, so my advice is, if you're a seller, you ask for as much as you can get. If you're a buyer, you put up as little as possible.
Right, right.
That seems to be standard. If the buyer's going to get a mortgage, that's a contingency. We need to know what that is. Is it going to be a 30-year conventional, a 30-year VA, or a 20-year? For how much money? Is it going to be $130,000 or $150,000? And at what interest rate? The maximum interest rate the buyer's willing to pay. There's a lot of details that we need to know that the buyer and seller really don't talk about because they don't know it. When they have a broker involved, the broker knows these things. So the broker talk about that and make sure that the contract package itself is all put together. But it's not impossible, certainly, for the lawyer to do the contract. Certainly, we do it all the time.
Okay.
Just takes more time for the lawyer to get done.
Can both the buyer and the seller use the same attorney?
Legally, it's possible. I should say ethically, it's possible. And it depends on the attorney. Some attorneys, as the matter of their practice, say no, they won't do that. They just do not want to get involved with it. But if an attorney is going to represent both sides, and quite often you find buyers and sellers will want that because they think that it's going to cost less. It may or may not, because the buyer's attorney has certain work that has to be done. The seller's attorney has certain work. If it's the same attorney, they've got all that work to do, regardless. But I think probably most attorneys would say, and this has always been my opinion, if I'm ever in that position, I'll say, I will discount the fee because I only have myself to argue with. I don't have another attorney to argue with, so that has some value. But ethically, an attorney can represent a buyer and a seller, but has to be full disclosure to both parties. And part of the disclosure is that if you seller and you buyer are having an issue, are arguing about something, I can't advise you on that at all. You guys have to go in the corner, fight it out, and come back and tell me what the answer is. But many times the buyer and the seller are moving forward. You know, they want to sell, they want to buy, they want to get it done. They've already worked everything out. It's possible for one attorney to represent both sides.
Okay, I just wondered about that. Now, what about home inspections? We did talk a little bit earlier about that in the. Now, should you be really careful who you get for an inspector? You know, like I'm thinking that maybe sometimes some of them overlook some things, maybe?
Possible. I think for the most part, well, to be a home inspector, you have to be certified by the state. And in my experience, the people I've seen to be home inspectors are like semi-retired contractors.
Oh, okay.
They've had a wealth of information, a wealth of experience in how a home ought to be constructed. And they get certified by the state. And I've never heard of one from any broker to say, avoid this person. I've had been involved with a trust buying some property where there was a home inspection done, and it was excellent. And I think these home inspectors all have availability to a program, computer program, where they can have a narrative and pictures to show what they found, which is very valuable because if they see a defect, they can take a picture of it. That picture shows up in their report, and it shows exactly what should be done. I know when I sold my home, the buyer had an inspection report. There was a loose brick in my fireplace that the grout had come around. And the inspector said that had to be fixed. So I got my trowel and my cement out and I fixed it.
Oh, you did it yourself?
Yeah, I did it myself. It was a simple job.
Oh, okay.
But there were some GFI outlets that needed the GFI protection near the sinks and this and that. I also had to install a radon removal system. That cost me $1,200.
Oh, wow.
That's getting to be a big deal now. But I knew that. I knew that was going to happen because where my house sat, it was on gravel.
Oh.
And I knew I was going to have a radon issue.
Oh,
So
okay.
I was prepared to pay for that.
Okay.
So, yeah, the home inspectors for the buyers, I think, is a really good idea because they know what they're looking for. And as I said earlier, having the seller have their own home inspector can head things off at the pass, can get things identified, and they get them fixed so that when the buyer's home inspector comes in, he won't find that much. Now, my opinion, and I've told every seller this when we've had a home inspector that the buyer has hired, expect them to find something because they're being hired to find something.
Okay.
They're being paid $200-300 to find something.
Okay.
They are going to find something. Otherwise, it looks like they didn't do anything for their fee. There's going to be something there.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I have known people who, even though they had an inspector come in, and then they fixed the things that needed to be fixed. Shortly after moving in, within a year or two, they start finding out about all of these
Other things?
other things. You know, is it possible for these things to not be that noticeable at the time?
Well, I think so, yes. Which is why most attorneys do not like early entry agreements. That's another issue where the house is vacant, seller's not in the area, the buyer wants to move in because they need to be out of their apartment, or they've sold their home and they have a moving truck coming today, so they want in. And I don't know of any attorney at all or any real estate broker that likes early entry, because the buyer looks at the property, they get the property inspector to look at it, and they're satisfied as to the condition, we're ready to close. But when you move in and actually start living somewhere, you start noticing things you didn't notice before. And then what has happened in the past is that people say, well, this is wrong and that's wrong, and I'm not closing until it's fixed. You know, and it just creates more and more problems. So early entry agreements, I get it, sometimes we have to do them. But in that case, we say, all right, buyer, you're accepting the property as it is. You know, other than, you know, at closing, the septic will be working and all that, but otherwise, the structure itself, you're accepting it as is as you move in. You've already looked at it, you've already inspected it. We don't want any more trouble, basically.
Oh, okay. So, but yeah, I know a lot of people do a lot to their homes when they're getting ready to put them up for sale, like painting all the walls. They're, you know, getting advice from people about what colors and even and things. If you're putting your house up for sale, what color the walls should be, and they put in new carpeting or new flooring or new toilets and.
Sure. I think a lot of really good brokers in the area will go through your house and say, all right, my recommendation is you do this, this, and this. Update this floor. Yeah, and some people have maybe a Kelly green wall painted in their family room because they like it. No, do a beige or a soft gray. You know, it's all these neutral tones. That's what you want to have for prospective buyers.
Right.
Because you want them to fall in love with the property, not go, ugh, I have to change that. Now, the other thing with that, Gail, too, is most buyers of residents, most buyers of homes that are younger, say non-retired people, probably need a mortgage to close the transaction.
Right.
My experience is that class of people do not have $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in their checking account to redo the floor and redo the bathroom and do this and that.
Right.
They have good income. They can support a larger mortgage because they have the income, but they don't have the cash to make repairs. So the seller might be better advised to make the repairs, like update the bathroom and things like that, and ask a higher price than to try to say, well, the next guy can update all this and spend $10,000, because the next guy may not have the $10,000. Now, if you're selling to perhaps retired people who have that in their bank account, that would work. But many times it doesn't work. So I think you get the best value out of your property by having it in the best condition, things updated, things looking good, maybe some new carpet. Really, really worn green shag carpet doesn't sell well.
No. I remember going to an estate sale one time, and the carpeting in the house was shades of green and red. It was one of those estate sales where you can go in and buy furniture and all that kind of thing. But I remember the carpeting was very unpleasant looking. Now, the closing date, is this a date that's certain that the seller must move by so the buyer can move in?
Oddly enough, buyers and sellers well, buyers in particular think so. But in New York State, a closing date is a target date. It doesn't say that in the contract. It says the transaction will be closed at the county clerk's office on this day. But legally, it is just a target date. I'll bet you probably 80% of the real estate transactions in Chautauqua County don't close on their stated closing date.
Oh, okay.
Well, a lot of times it's because of what we talked about earlier. You have to get the title search and get it updated, and you have to get the survey, and you can't get the surveyor to release the survey until he gets a copy of the updated title search. So it's all these things that string along. So in New York, it's a target date unless the parties agree that time is of the essence. And that's a legal term, time is of the essence. If that's in the contract on the closing date, it's got to close on that date, or somebody can back out, probably the buyer. Normally that's not in a contract, and what's going to happen is if it takes too long, there's too much time between the stated closing date and when it's going to happen, and we're not even sure it's going to happen, one of the parties can issue a time is of the essence letter to the other and say, all right, we're declaring this date probably 2 weeks in advance. This is time of the essence date. If it's not closed by then, I'm canceling everything.
Oh, so that can be done then.
It can be done. It's not done very often. Even though I've seen transactions that have gone months past the closing date, but everybody's working towards it. There are just some issues that came up, some problems, but everybody's working towards that closing because they still want to sell and the buyer still wants to buy. That's probably more normal.
Yeah, a friend of mine and her husband were in sort of a situation like that last year, but they're living on the West Coast right now until the husband retires, and then they're going to move back to this part of the country in a few years. But he got a job transfer last fall from the state of Washington to the state of California. And well, they were waiting to get the money from the sale of the house so that they could make the move. And the people who were buying it were in a hurry to get them out of there. You know, they managed to work it out okay, but eventually,
it's quite frustrating. To have the closing process is quite frustrating. There's an attorney in Jamestown that always called these thermonuclear real estate closings, because that's about what it was. Everybody has their situation that they want to accommodate, and everybody's situation is different. So yeah, you have a seller that needs to move, but they don't have a place to go to yet. You have the buyer who's moving in from another state, and the moving van is on the way. I mean, it will be here next Tuesday, and they got to be in, and you just try to work that out the best you can. There are some sellers that, even though you tell them when the closing date happens, you got to be gone. You have to move. The buyer has the right to have the house then. And they say, well, I don't have a place to go to. I need at least another month, you know. And you have to negotiate this stuff, you know.
Yeah,
if you were committed to sell, didn't you think you needed to have some place to go to?
Right. I've never been able to understand that. Like some people just put their houses up for sale and wait to sell it. That's a concept that I've always had trouble understanding. Aren't you supposed to buy something else first, you know?
Well, I'll tell you, the conundrum is this. I don't want to own two houses. You know, I don't want to buy the new house. And by the way, I need my money from the old house to buy the new house. So I go to the bank, I get a mortgage on the old house and the new house so I can buy the new house. But now I got a big mortgage payment, and I want to sell the old house. What if it doesn't sell for a year? What if it takes a year and a half to sell, you know?
What about 5 years?
Or 5 years. In the meantime, you're paying taxes on two houses, one of which is vacant, which is another whole problem. So there's no real good solution, although the safe way to do it probably is this way. You sell the old house, move into an apartment.
Oh, okay.
For a year, then look for the new house, and then give your your landlord enough time, the required notice, so that you can, most people don't do that because they want to move from old house to new house. It's very difficult, I think, to have the closing on both houses and the moving all organized to happen on the same day. It's almost impossible.
Yeah.
When I sold my house and I moved into my condo, happily, the lady that had owned my condo had passed away and her kids owned it, so it was vacant. And yes, I did have to have an early entry for a week, I think it was, or less than a week, because I'd sold my house and I had to be out by a certain date. And I moved on December 18th in a snowstorm, and it wasn't a lot of fun, but I did. But the nice thing was the sellers were easy to deal with. They let me go in a week early, and that was fine. And the house or the condo was vacant, so that was good for me. But when you're selling your house, buying a new house, and that seller of the new house has to move, there's a whole chain reaction of things that have to happen, and it's miserable.
Right. Well, this friend of mine and her husband, when they got to California, they wound up living in an extended stay hotel for several months until they were able to find something that was in decent shape that they could afford to rent. So, because they decided after they got down there not to buy, because he's going to retire in 5 years, and then they're going to move back to the area. So,
the selling and moving is not an easy task.
No.
The other thing is, if you're buying a house that maybe is in an estate like I did, that sometimes is easier because you have a vacant house, so maybe you can get in a few days early, or at least move things over and store them there. That's sometimes a big help. But people who are dealing with estate property, like executors, in my experience, I found that usually if you get an appraised value of the house, probably you're going to get less on a sale price, because the brokers will appraise property based upon what similar property sold in the last year or so. And the selling cycle in our area might be a year. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more. But if you hold out for a year, you get your price. Well, if you have a vacant house, either you own it and it's vacant or it's in an estate, it's costing you money every month to keep that house. So if you hold out for the big price that you might get a year later, you've already paid taxes for one whole year, utilities and everything, and had to mow the lawn and do all that, and that's just expense that nobody's getting a benefit out of. So I've always told my executors in estates or trustees that, expect to have less. I would list the property and tell them, list the property to the broker and say, list it at a price that it's going to sell in 3 months. Let's make it realistic. So maybe I'm getting $10,000 less than what I'd like, but I'm getting it sold and getting it done with.
Because I might be spending that $10,000 for everything else that I have to do while I'm waiting to sell it.
And the other thing you have to worry about is homeowners insurance on a vacant house. Insurance companies do not like vacant houses, especially if it's outside, it's certain spots in the city or outside in the country. Because vacant homes are targets for vandalism.
They are,
And fires.
And fires. Like arsonists?
Vandalism and fire. Well, kids get into a house and it's cool this time of year, so they start a fire in the living room floor. Who knows what people do. They burn houses down. So I have had situations where an insurance company has found out a person has passed away and they've canceled the insurance on the house. And they had the right to under the terms of the policy. So you have to weigh all these things in when you're dealing with a vacant house and say, am I willing to accept a little less to get a quicker sale so I don't have problems in other areas?
Right. Yeah. I remember this particular friend that I mentioned, she said that there was a few different times when they had the house up for sale, but of course they were still living in it, until the closing date. But she said that people were sneaking up on up the steps to the back door to just snoop and peek in the window instead of making an appointment with a real estate agent to look at it, she said she was having to chase people away.
Yeah, that's true. Well, if you have a sign in your front yard that says for sale, people are curious.
Yeah.
They want to peek inside to see if it's something that they might be interested in, or they're just nosy. I mean, there are some people that just like to see what your house looks like. So they may even contact a broker and have a showing, never intending to buy it, just because they want to look at it.
Just because they're nosy,
Yeah.
like peeping Toms.
Yeah, something like that.
Now we're down to 2.5 minutes.
That went fast.
Yes, it did. Is there anything you would like Kameron to mention before we sign off?
Well, we didn't talk too much about what a buyer should do in considering buying a piece of property.
Oh, okay.
So I think most buyers are going to contact a broker to say, find me a house and show me some houses. But a buyer may have to get a mortgage. A smart thing, and most all brokers would tell a buyer this, go to your bank, get pre-approved on your mortgage. It will
right.
speed things up for closing.
Right.
But the other thing is the buyer needs to identify the attorney that they want. It might be the bank attorney. The bank attorney can represent the buyer too, and quite often that's done. But again, I think make an appointment, go see the attorney, get the preliminary information so that that's done ahead of time, so we're not wasting time because we don't have enough information going on. And I think anytime you're dealing with an attorney on any case, it's better to sit down with someone. Maybe it's not the attorney, maybe it's a legal assistant, but go in face to face and so they know who you are and know how to contact you and have information right up front to make the process go easier. I think the whole idea of this discussion is let's make the process go easier and faster. Let's get some things that used to be done too far behind the contract, let's get it done in front of the contract so that things will go faster on the closing. Makes everybody happy.
I'm thinking maybe too, people should have a wish list of things that they want in a house, like if they want a 2-story house or a 1-story house, so they're not running around looking at houses that really don't fit what they'd like, like
Yeah, I agree.
the basement's in good shape, or just any of those.
Oh yeah,
any of those
that's a
things.
great suggestion, because like school district, if it's a young family with kids, they want to have a home in a school district that has a good school. That can be very important for them.
Right.
So yeah, a wish list of what the ideal house is, and know that you're not going to get the ideal house.
Probably
it's never the
not.
ideal house.
Probably not.
If you can get 9 out of 10, you've got a good house.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Kameron, for coming on again, and I'll see the rest of you in the viewing audience on the next episode in a couple of weeks.